So, Evelyn, did you kill Stephen?
No, he was my perfect husband with me. No.
Back in 2002, 32-year-old Englishman Stephen Davis was gunned down in his apartment in the Philippines. The police inquiry was hopeless, having neither the resources nor the leads to make any inroads into the case. Stephen's mother, however, would take matters into her own hands, travelling halfway across the world and beginning an epic crusade to track down and bring the perpetrator to justice. Nothing would stand in her way. Manila, the Philippines. It was during a hot night in July 2002 that Stephen Davis was murdered in his apartment. Back in England, Margaret Davis, Stephen's mother, remembered getting a phone call the following day. She said a voice at the other end of the phone simply said, "Stephen's had an accident. He's dead, Margaret." And then the line was cut off. She said she was numb, and she sat motionless in disbelief for an hour before a second call came through. She discovered that Stephen had been murdered, shot dead by 3 gunmen in the middle of the night in his apartment. These calls weren't from the Home Office or the police. They weren't from Stephen's wife, Evelyn, with whom he had a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. These calls had come from her son's best friend, Mike, who had been asleep in the same apartment in the room next door to Stephen. Stephen was born in 1970 and grew up with 2 younger sisters in Nottingham. Tragically, his father was killed in an accident when he was only 14, and his sisters recalled how, seemingly overnight, Stephen changed from this playful, carefree older brother to feeling as though he was now responsible for the family and taking on what he perceived as his father's position in the house. Sometime later, Stephen's mother, Margaret, began a relationship with a man named Alan, and she recalled how it was very heartwarming to see how Stephen and Alan were able to bond, and how it was great that he had a sort of father figure again. Nevertheless, Stephen was still a quiet, rather shy young man who didn't really like to mix socially. He was intelligent and showed a real aptitude for computers, and particularly programming. Yes, he was considered a bit nerdy by friends, but by all accounts, a nice guy. When Stephen was only 21, he'd been working at a computer company in Nottingham already for a year, when he was approached by a larger firm in Hong Kong and offered a position there for triple the salary. Margaret, his mother, encouraged him to go for it, but a couple of his friends said that, in hindsight, perhaps it hadn't been the best option for Stephen at that time. He was intelligent and hard-working, sure, but he was also fairly naive and young. Once settled, he took up a new hobby and joined a flying club. This club was located a 2-hour flight away in Angeles City in the Philippines. Angeles is known as the city where many young professionals come to party and relax and meet girls. His friend Mike remembers that Stephen was rather surprisingly a hit with the ladies. He said they liked him because he was tall, blondish hair, Western features, with a great sense of humour. They felt comfortable around him, and of course he loved the attention. Daram Samar is a remote island in the Philippines. You can only reach it by boat, and there's no electricity or running water. Evelyn Bohol, the woman Stephen would eventually fall in love with and marry, grew up here. Her family remain there to this day. Her mother and father remember Evelyn as a good child, quiet, helpful, always ready to pitch in and take care of her younger siblings. And when her father was ill for a time, she also worked, making mats to sell in the family's small business. When her auntie asked her, aged 10, what she wanted to be as an adult, she said, "I want to be a bar girl so that I can marry an American." Like Stephen, Evelyn also decided to leave home and find a job to help support her family. She was just 13 when she left the island and moved to Angeles City, a grueling 2-day journey by bus and boat. It's where many young girls go to find work, because Angeles is known as the sex capital of the Philippines. Many lie about their ages, and girls as young as 12 earn £1 a night for dancing in bars like this one, and up to £5 if they have sex with a customer. It often descends into a spiral where girls become hooked on drugs in order to cope with the lifestyle they're forced to continue doing. The only way out is often the hope that a rich man will come and rescue them. And that's basically what happened to Evelyn. The two met in one of these bars, and Stephen was instantly infatuated with Evelyn. Margaret said that Stephen had told her that they'd met in a bar, and initially she hadn't realised what that meant, that girls are paid for their services. Stephen took Evelyn out on a date, and then went back to her place of work and paid the bar owner a fee of £500 in order to release her from her contract there. Evelyn was thrilled. She told her relatives that her prince had come, that Stephen was kind and attractive, and, perhaps most tellingly, that he had plenty of money. When Margaret found out what Evelyn had done previously at the bar, she was shocked. Stephen tried to explain about the way of life there and said, "Mum, if I can rescue just one girl from that bar life, just one, and that's what I've done." It was during a visit to Hong Kong in 1997 that Margaret met Evelyn for the first time. She was just 17 years old, 10 years younger than Stephen. Margaret noticed that Evelyn was quiet, polite, and, in her words, totally acceptable. During the visit, Stephen made a surprise announcement that they were getting married. Of course, Margaret and Stephen's stepfather, Alan, were invited to the wedding, which took place at the registry office. The only hiccup they hadn't foreseen was the fact that, never having been to school, Evelyn wasn't able to read the wedding vows. However, the couple seemed happy and even extended an invitation to Margaret and Alan to join them on their honeymoon to the tropical island of Puerto Galera. It was here that Margaret, in particular, noticed some rather worrying behaviour from her new daughter-in-law. She said there were several times that when Stephen went to take Evelyn's hand as they were walking, she'd often push him away. In her opinion, it just seemed that Stephen was madly in love with Evelyn, but that she did not demonstrate the same level of affection with him. Even so, the two settled in Hong Kong, seeming to adapt to married life very well. They had a daughter, Jessica, in 1999, and then a son, Joshua, 2 years later, before moving back to Angeles City, where Evelyn had been a dancer in the bars 4 years previously. This time, however, it was a completely different world she was living in. The family rented a house in the most expensive part of town. Stephen was earning £60,000 a year as a computer technician, and he gave Evelyn a monthly allowance of £1,000. He employed a housekeeper and a maid, who also acted as a live-in nanny, taking care of the children. Margaret said that Evelyn didn't lift a finger at home, instead preferring to lie in bed all day. And when she challenged Stephen about this, he simply said, "She doesn't have to, Mum. She's my princess." But Stephen wasn't just financing Evelyn's lifestyle. He was regularly sending money back to her parents on the island. They were able to buy a large fishing boat and to construct the only brick house in their village. He often paid their fares to visit them in Angeles City too. Sometimes they would stay there for weeks at a time. Margaret and Alan also visited at least once a year. During one visit, they noticed that Evelyn was acting strangely. She was texting furtively, and she would go a little bit away from the group to make a phone call, and they would hear her giggling to whoever she was talking to. They said her attitude was somehow very different, that she'd be irritable and short with Stephen, and it was Alan that first suggested to Margaret that perhaps Evelyn had found a new boyfriend. In fact, Evelyn's own sister, Gina, who'd moved in with the family to babysit, asked her directly whether the rumours were true, and Evelyn confirmed that, yes, she'd been seeing a man. He was a local who worked for a security company, and his name was Arnold Adore. Meanwhile, Stephen wasn't stupid. Even he was becoming suspicious of Evelyn. Money had been going missing, and one day He was mortified when he took his daughter, Jessica, to her new nursery school, only to be turned away and told by staff that her name wasn't even on their list. He'd given the substantial sum for the school fees to Evelyn, and it had somehow disappeared. Later it transpired that Evelyn's lover, Arnold, had recently come into enough money to buy a new motorbike, though. For his part, Stephen also began to distance himself from Evelyn. After work, instead of going home, he'd go out with friends and visit the bars and clubs he used to frequent before he was married. His friend Mike appeared to suggest that, although he wasn't having an ongoing affair, he suspected that Stephen had had the odd one-night stand. Despite this, it's thought that Stephen still clung to the hope that his marriage could be repaired. He gave Evelyn an ultimatum, demanding that she paid back the money that had gone missing, and either get a job or go to college. But she refused, and in response he threatened her with divorce, something that would, in all probability, mean that she would lose every privilege she'd become accustomed to, and end up either working back in the seedy bars of Angeles City or returning to her family's rural province, neither of which was an appealing prospect. On the 18th of July 2002, Margaret got the phone call that was to turn their world upside down. First, they refused to believe it. Stephen used that apartment during the week while he was working in Manila with his business partner, Mike. Mike woke up when 3 men broke in. One held a gun to his head and asked him, in Tagalog, "Is this him?" He was told no, and then they burst into Stephen's room and, upon seeing him, fired 4 shots into his body. After they fled, Mike checked Stephen but found no pulse, and then he called the emergency services. On hearing the story, Margaret immediately voiced her suspicions. Had this got anything to do with Evelyn? Initially, Alan said he couldn't see it. She was a lot of things, but a cold-blooded murderer. Not to mention the fact there was nothing tying her to the crime scene. Margaret and Alan flew out to the Philippines immediately. At the funeral home, they encountered Evelyn sitting inside on a chair. As they went in, she didn't stand up or acknowledge them at all, and she refused to join them as they viewed Stephen's casket, Alan recalling that she never even shed a tear. Eventually, Margaret coaxed her over, and the first thing she said was, "Have you seen Mike?" Here they were, standing over Stephen's body, and the first thing she said was, "Have you seen Mike?" Margaret said it was at that moment that she decided to note down and record diligently every interaction that she had with Evelyn. The police had very limited resources and virtually no leads. They questioned business associates but came up with nothing. Margaret wasn't giving up so easily. She engaged her own private investigator, who conducted round-the-clock surveillance on Evelyn, discovering that 2 men were visiting her home regularly, her boyfriend Arnold and another man who worked with him. They passed this information on to the police, who brought both men in for questioning. Ultimately, Stephen's business partner, Mike, was able to identify both individuals as 2 of the men who broke into the property that evening and held a gun to his head, and they were subsequently arrested and detained. But having made some progress during the 8 weeks they'd been in the Philippines, Margaret and Alan were warned that it was becoming increasingly dangerous for them to stay. Family members of the accused men knew where they were living, and the authorities were unable to offer any sort of protection. However, Margaret wasn't leaving without one important thing: her grandchildren. She convinced Evelyn to let her have Jessica to stay with her for a couple of nights, and she, Alan and Jessica secretly boarded a plane out of the Philippines 2 days later. It was gut-wrenching for Margaret, having to leave baby Joshua behind, but she hadn't been able to locate him. She and Alan were physically, financially, and emotionally exhausted and needed to regroup. Margaret spoke about being halfway down her checklist as they sat waiting to leave on the aeroplane. Yes, she was leaving her grandson behind with his mother, the woman she was sure had something to do with Stephen's death. But she had Jessica. She had her son's ashes in her suitcase. And they had 2 suspects detained in a jail cell. Her next priority was her grandson Joshua's safety. Margaret discovered that he was staying with Evelyn's parents, and she asked her PI to go over to the island and offer the family £200 to release the boy. Evelyn's father spoke about the conversation they had. Joshua's maternal grandparents were heartbroken to give up the little boy they loved, but they realised that it was impossible for them to offer him the opportunities that Margaret was capable of giving him. Evelyn's father admitted that if he'd stayed, they couldn't even have afforded to send him to school. So, 8 weeks after Jessica had come to live with them in the UK, baby Joshua arrived back at London Heathrow and was reunited with her again. For Margaret, the feeling of relief was overwhelming. But the work didn't stop. For 2 years, Margaret worked tirelessly from their house in Nottingham every single day, determined to get to the bottom of the case and achieve some sort of justice for her murdered son. She spent thousands and thousands of pounds pursuing every lead, even paying the police department's petrol money when they conducted interviews. Thankfully, Evelyn's relatives were extremely sympathetic to her situation, and they'd been in weekly contact with each other via email since Joshua had left. This paid off, because eventually it was Evelyn's brother-in-law, Gina's husband, who was to provide the final piece of the puzzle. When the police had tried to question him, he'd gone into hiding. Fortunately for Margaret, Evelyn's auntie had known where he was and tipped the police off. And when questioned, Robin Butas caved under the pressure and admitted that he was the 3rd man on that fateful night. He said that he hadn't had any idea what was going to happen when Evelyn had picked him up in her car that evening. The 4 then drove to Manila with Arnold and his friend and parked outside Stephen's apartment. Evelyn handed Arnold the keys and she waited downstairs in the car while the 3 men carried out the attack. Robin confirmed that it had been Arnold who had fired the 4 shots at Stephen. In return for his cooperation and in acting as a state witness, Robin Butas was spared prosecution. However, Arnold Adore and his associate were convicted and are serving life sentences. In February 2004, Evelyn was also arrested and charged with Stephen's murder. In her case, a judge was able to consider all the evidence and decide whether her actions made her responsible for Stephen's death. Evelyn denied everything, but there was convincing evidence against her. The perpetrator had keys, there was Robin's testimony, and the fact that her alibi was shattered when a neighbour reported seeing her returning home in the early hours that evening after she'd already claimed to have been in bed asleep. There were a staggering 14 people giving evidence against Evelyn, but not a single person willing to support her in court. While they waited for the judge's decision, Evelyn spent weeks in prison, abandoned by her family and only visited once by her father. In November 2004, 2.5 years after her son was murdered, Margaret travelled back to the Philippines to be there in court when the judge gave his verdict. She said she was apprehensive but hopeful that they would get the results that they'd been working for and finally some sense of justice. Evelyn was found guilty of conspiring to murder her husband and sentenced to life in prison, which in the Philippines is a minimum of 40 years before consideration for parole. Margaret wept openly in court. She told waiting reporters that she hadn't felt any pleasure in knowing that her daughter-in-law was going to prison, as it wouldn't bring her son back. She was granted 10 minutes to speak in private with Evelyn before she was taken away. Evelyn continued to deny everything. Margaret gave her a folder with photos and pictures that Jessica and Joshua had drawn for her. And then she left. Apart from the following letter, Margaret and her family have never had any contact with Evelyn again. Dear Evelyn, you were convicted in court for the murder of your husband Stephen with the help of your boyfriend Arnold Adore. Nothing you say will convince me that you're innocent. I am leaving you and the Philippines now. Justice has been done, and you will spend the next 40 years in prison. You will be an old woman with a wasted life. You had everything. Stephen called you his princess, and I loved you very much. You are an evil woman with no thought for the lives you have ruined. I hope the sacrifice of your family was worth the short time for your love with Adore. You took my son, and now I have yours, and your daughter, who someday will come and ask, "Why, Mummy? Why were you so bad and leave us and kill our daddy?" I will enjoy your children, and we shall have some happy times and not think of you. I will never forgive you or see you ever again. You were no longer a daughter of mine. Margaret. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you've got a second, please like it. That really helps it get seen by others. And please subscribe if you want to see other cases like this. As always, take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.